In the summer of 2001, a suburban mom in her late 50s, named Cindy Truman, stood nursing a beer inside of a Philadelphia dive bar. The venue had a small stage in the corner where her 31-year-old nephew, Jackson Domenico, would soon be playing with his band. Cindy didn't know much about the kind of music her nephew made, but according to her son, it was very loud. She noticed one of her nephew's friends, Matt Chambers, at a table against the wall. He waved her over, and he warned Cindy to prepare herself. Jackson's performances could get pretty crazy. About 10 minutes later, the lights turned down, and Jackson walked on stage carrying a guitar, and he was followed by a second guitarist and also a drummer. The music started off soft and dreamy, but gradually, Jackson layered loops of noise into a chaotic cloud of sound. Cindy had never heard anything like it. There was no melody or chorus. It honestly just sounded like a thunderstorm. The music echoed all around the room, building into a roar. Cindy at first tried to enjoy it, but honestly the noise was overwhelming. And at some point, she set her beer down and just stuck her fingers in her ears. Glancing around the room, she was surprised to see that pretty much everybody in there seemed to be enjoying this. In fact, there was a group of guys with long hair standing right in front of the stage, swaying violently, headbanging to the music. Then, at some point, the drummer started going into this frenzy and smashing all his cymbals, while Jackson laid on his back and stuck his head right in front of the bass drum. He kept thrashing at his guitar until the drummer picked up one of his smaller drums and hurled it at a speaker. Then Jackson and the other guitarist began bashing their guitars against their amplifiers. Each hit made a clanging, deafening roar like steel beams clattering to the ground. But the crowd just chanted and cheered with everything they did. After the set finally came to an end, Cindy found herself shaking her head like she had water stuck in her ears. Matt laughed and asked her how she liked it. Cindy admitted this was definitely not her taste, but she was happy to see her nephew pursuing something he loved. Matt told Cindy that he agreed with her and thought the music sounded like an airplane landing, but he agreed it was great to see Jackson having so much fun. A few minutes later, Jackson came out from backstage and joined Cindy and Matt at the table. He was smiling ear to ear and covered in sweat. Cindy gave him a big hug and said congratulations. Then she asked him when his next show was. But Jackson shouted that his ears were ringing too loud for him to hear anything. He told her this only lasted for a few hours after his show, and then it went away. A small price to pay for getting to do the thing that he loved most in the world. The following year, in the spring of 2002, Jackson sat inside of a French airport terminal waiting to board a flight back home. He had just finished up a month-long tour of England and other European countries, playing guitar for a different band than his usual group. Normally, he would have loved for the tour to last as long as possible, but this time he was actually pretty eager to get home to Philadelphia. A few weeks ago, something had happened during one of their shows. Jackson had been on stage playing guitar, getting lost in the music like always, when he felt something inside of his ear spasm, or maybe even snap. At the time, he was so focused on just getting through the show that he hadn't thought much of it. Their performances were always very loud, so it was common for his ears to feel a bit battered afterwards. But this time was different. The following morning, Jackson's ears were not ringing. They were throbbing. It was hard to describe. His ears hurt in ways that they never had before. Now, normally, after a particularly loud show, Jackson would notice that sounds were a bit muffled, like his hearing had been temporarily dulled by the excessive volume. But this now was the opposite. His ears felt intensely sensitive and full of pressure, similar to the way they felt on an airplane during takeoff or landing. Although this feeling was much worse than that, and much weirder. Jackson's hearing was now so sharp that even the smallest sound seemed so loud. Just walking down the block to the pharmacy to buy earplugs had been an ordeal because of ordinary sounds. Buses braking, shop doorbells ringing, movers shouting as they unloaded a van. It felt like the everyday sounds of the city were attacking him. When it was time to board the plane, Jackson switched with his bandmate and took the window seat to try to isolate himself as much as possible. His earplugs helped a little, but not enough. Jackson pulled his beanie down over his ears, closed his eyes, and slumped against the window. He hoped the cabin pressure wouldn't make his ears feel worse than they already did. Jackson promised himself that the second he got home, he would make an appointment to see a doctor and find out what was going on with his ears. He needed to get this fixed in time for his next show. Another year later, on an autumn afternoon in 2003, Jackson lay on his back with his arms at his side, gritting his teeth in pain. He was inside a white cylindrical MRI machine that was so giant it looked like part of a space shuttle. For over half an hour, Jackson flinched as the machine droned, pulsed, and screeched. Anyone would find its harsh mechanical sounds abrasive, but for Jackson, they were torture. The session left him feeling totally ragged. But Jackson didn't have a choice. Ever since returning to Philadelphia from his European tour last year, Jackson's hearing had only grown more sensitive. Now every sound, even extremely quiet ones, caused him stabbing physical pain. Making it through a regular day in the city with all its harsh noises was nearly unbearable. However, despite a full year of medical appointments, Jackson's search for a cure so far had been fruitless. Jackson had visited every type of specialist: ear, nose, and throat doctors, neurologists, audiologists, psychiatrists, even dentists. Each of them had different theories about what might be causing Jackson's sonic sensitivity, but none of them knew for sure. But even more disappointing was that none of the doctors knew how to fix Jackson's condition, or if it was even possible to fix. One dentist that Jackson met with thought that his hearing sensitivity might be related to an unspecified issue with his jaw, and so he had Jackson wear a mouthguard for several months to see if it made a difference, but it didn't. Another doctor suggested that Jackson try sound therapy, a method that used gentle ambient background sound to recalibrate the ears, but Jackson couldn't take it. Even at the lowest volume, the soft sounds felt like steel wool scouring his brain. Other doctors proposed more holistic remedies, like acupuncture, while some just told Jackson his best bet was painkillers. And so Jackson tried a wide variety of medications and treatment, but he never got more than short-term relief. The pain always returned, just as severe as before. Finally, all the sounds of the MRI machine sort of ebbed down to a hum, and then the machine went quiet. The table that Jackson was lying on slid out from the tunnel of the machine. Once he was out of the MRI, Jackson sat up, his head in a fog. He felt battered and woozy from the long, noisy session. Jackson's doctor told him that he would assess the results of the MRI scan and be in touch soon. Jackson thanked him, but realistically, he didn't feel optimistic. So many of the doctors he had seen had told Jackson they just couldn't determine anything actually medically wrong with him. Some of them even implied that the pain might be psychological, like Jackson was just imagining it. Jackson carefully inserted his custom earplugs and then stepped out of the clinic into the cold, windy parking lot. His mind wandered as he drove to his Aunt Cindy's house in the suburbs, where he was currently living in her basement. It was not an ideal living situation, but it was at least a lot quieter than his apartment in the city. Plus, Cindy had loaned him her old car so he could drive to his office job at a cable company instead of taking the bus. Being able to roll up the windows and keep the noise of the world at a distance was life-saving right now. As Jackson opened the door to his aunt's house, he heard the whole family in the kitchen eating dinner. He would have liked to join them, but the sound of metal utensils on plates was just too painful for him to be around. So he had actually begun eating meals alone because of it. Just as Jackson headed downstairs to his room in the basement, he overheard his name being mentioned at the table. It was his cousin's voice, scolding Cindy for babying Jackson. He told her Jackson's only real problem was that he was lazy and depressed. It was not the first time he'd heard someone mock or deny his condition, but it still made Jackson's blood boil. To be in agonizing pain day and night, yet not be able to medically explain it, or even prove that it existed, just added another layer to his sense of being cursed. If he had, for example, lost a limb, something obvious, people would accept and understand that he was suffering. But with this, he was lost in his own private, misunderstood hell. Downstairs in the basement, Jackson closed the door and crawled into bed. He looked over at the corner of his room, where his guitars and his amplifiers were shoved in a pile and covered by a sheet. It was a reminder of everything he had lost and left behind. He hadn't been able to play guitar for the past year, ever since his hearing had become painful. And in losing music, Jackson felt like he'd lost part of himself, and he was scared he might never be able to get it back. He swallowed a few painkillers and then put a pillow over his head. All he could do was try to shut out the world and disappear. The next morning was like all the rest. Jackson woke to the sound of muffled footsteps upstairs, which to him sounded like a giant stomping around. Jackson crawled out of bed and dressed for work. Thankfully, his boss was understanding and flexible about all of Jackson's doctor visits. If anything, his boss actually seemed pleased that Jackson had stopped requesting extra time off for music tours. After a stressful drive through morning rush hour traffic, Jackson clocked in and went to his cubicle. Even with his earplugs in, the click of keys on his computer felt like little tacks poking into his skull. Luckily, his work phone, which rang often, could be permanently muted, so there was just a little flashing light to indicate when a call was coming in. At first, Jackson had tried to explain his condition to some of his coworkers, but they had so many follow-up questions. And frankly, conversation itself was just so painful for him that he wanted to avoid it. So now he basically avoided all of them. He ate lunch alone at his desk, using only paper or styrofoam dishes. Anything else was too loud. Before this all started, Jackson had not minded his boring job because he was always daydreaming about new music to make, or anticipating a music gig coming up. But without music or a social life to look forward to, his routine became increasingly joyless. Driving home, he couldn't even listen to the radio. He just sat silently inside of his metal box and tried to avoid getting honked at. Back at his Aunt Cindy's house, he slipped quietly in the back door and went downstairs. Day after day felt just the same, like he was a ghost trapped outside of life looking in. Jackson turned on his computer and emailed a few music friends. He tried not to sound bitter, but it was hard when all of his old friends were still making records and playing shows and going to parties like nothing had changed. Just then, his Aunt Cindy cracked open the door, holding a plate of dinner. She tiptoed inside and then handed Jackson the food and took a seat on his bed. She whispered for him to not give up hope. She promised they would not stop looking for a doctor who could help him, but Jackson just nodded blankly. Then he went to the corner where his favorite Fender guitar lay beneath the sheet. He grabbed it and handed the guitar to Cindy and told her to give it to his cousin Megan, who had just started taking guitar lessons. Jackson had played this particular instrument in every single one of his performances since he was a teenager, but now he couldn't stand to be around it anymore. It was just too painful of a reminder. Cindy looked troubled and just gave Jackson a long hug. And while Jackson knew she meant well, this actually made him feel like an invalid. Jackson was tired of being such a burden to his family. After Cindy left, Jackson began making a list of friends and family to give away the rest of his music stuff to. He wanted someone else to treasure these instruments and the equipment and the records that had brought him so much joy over the years. Whatever Jackson's future looked like, he knew it would have to be lived in silence. 3 years later, in the summer of 2006, Jackson stood among a pile of cardboard boxes in an empty apartment. Even though his hearing was just as painful as ever, he had done the unthinkable, moved out of his Aunt Cindy's basement and rented his own apartment in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. He felt intimidated, but also excited. It had all happened so fast. A couple of months earlier, Jackson's friend, Matt, had forwarded Jackson a listing for a job opening at the same big media company where he worked. Despite his reservations, Jackson had applied. And the very next week, he received an email that he had been hired. Holding the apartment keys and standing inside of his clean new place, Jackson allowed himself a small moment of happiness. Maybe there were better days ahead for him. And Jackson had another reason to be hopeful. He had heard about a neurologist at Columbia University Medical Center, which was in New York, who was renowned for treating rare hearing conditions. It seemed like there was a chance he might be able to help. A week later, Jackson went to the Columbia Medical Center for an appointment with that neurologist. Crossing the city on foot with his condition was not easy, but he kept his earplugs wedged in tightly, with a thick winter hat pulled down low, and he avoided the busier streets. Jackson spent the day at the medical center. The neurologist ran a battery of tests to assess Jackson's condition. He had Jackson put on headphones and listen to a series of very subtle sounds to chart his range of hearing. Other tests were more mental, like memory games and problem solving. The neurologist also studied Jackson's other senses, like his vision and sense of touch. And so Jackson left the clinic feeling sort of unsure about what had just happened, but he was cautiously optimistic. A couple of days later, Jackson received a call at work. It was the neurologist, and he got right to the point. After thoroughly studying all the test results, it was evident that Jackson's condition was permanent. The neurologist was familiar with Jackson's condition, and unfortunately, there was nothing he or any other medical professional could do to reverse it. Jackson hung up the phone in a daze. Despite everything he had gone through the past few years, he had always held out a small sliver of hope that some doctor out there might know of an experimental surgery or an expensive hearing aid or something that could cure or at least alleviate most of his condition. But here, finally, was the diagnosis Jackson had been dreading. It felt like his fate was officially sealed. Music had always been his reason for living, his passion, his escape, his one gift in this world. And now it had been officially ripped away from him forever. Jackson walked to his apartment like a man on death row. His head hung low as he trudged through the chaotic streets of New York. Gridlocked taxis honking at each other, hot dog vendors shouting up and down the block, loud musicians playing on every corner. Jackson flinched at the sharp stab of every sound. Back at his apartment, Jackson sat down on the floor and loaded a pipe with marijuana, and then he lit it. He held in the smoke as long as he could, then leaned back and closed his eyes. He felt like he had reached the end of the road. It had been simply too much pain for too long, with no end in sight. A few months later, on Halloween night, Jackson's friend, Matt Chambers, turned up his collar against the cold city winds as he made his way towards Harlem. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed from store windows, while packs of kids in costumes went door to door shouting for candy. But Matt's mind was somewhere else. 3 days earlier, Jackson had not shown up at work, which was highly unusual. Matt called him that night and left a message, but didn't hear back. Today had been Jackson's third day in a row as a no-show, and still he had not heard from him. So, after work, Matt decided to pay Jackson a visit in person. Once he reached Jackson's building, he pressed the buzzer for Jackson's apartment. He knew Jackson had muted the sound function, but he had also rigged a light to blink whenever a guest rang. When Jackson didn't answer, Matt assumed he just hadn't seen the light yet, or maybe he was out somewhere. So, Matt decided to go down the block to grab a slice of pizza and wait before trying again. But halfway to the pizza shop, Matt noticed a sound getting louder and louder. Sirens echoing through the streets. Matt looked back towards Jackson's building just as an ambulance raced around the corner, its lights flashing. The vehicle sped down the street and then screeched to a stop as a pair of EMTs hopped out and ran inside the building. Matt felt panicked as he sprinted towards the ambulance. He had a bad feeling he already knew which apartment these EMTs were running toward. Later that week, Matt stepped inside of Jackson's place for the first time in months. The place looked grim. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, ashtrays full of half-smoked joints scattered all around, unpacked boxes stacked in corners, and it smelled like the kitchen trash hadn't been emptied in a long time. Matt had been right about where those paramedics were going. That day, as Matt was headed to visit Jackson, someone else had already found his friend's dead body inside of his apartment. Jackson had taken his own life. Afterwards, Jackson's Aunt Cindy had asked Matt to help go through Jackson's possessions with her so she wouldn't have to survey the apartment by herself. And so eventually, while they were looking around the apartment, Matt and Cindy went into Jackson's bedroom and flipped on his computer. Cindy was hoping to find a note of some kind, but the desktop was empty, except for a few audio files and a document of financial information. Everything else had apparently been deleted. Cindy knew that Jackson used to obsessively archive all his recordings, but she wondered if maybe in Jackson's final hours, he decided to just purge everything. Rummaging through Jackson's drawers and closets, Cindy felt disturbed at how her nephew had been living. The place was cluttered, yet also empty somehow. Cindy knew Jackson had been struggling, but she hadn't realized how hopeless he had become. Under Jackson's bed, Cindy found a plastic tub stuffed with several dozen manila envelopes. Each was labeled with the name of a doctor he had visited, and each one contained pamphlets of medical information and test results. In a sense, they were a physical record of Jackson's journey through this condition that ultimately killed him. Finally, in a bottom drawer beside the bed, Cindy found Jackson's suicide note. In it, Jackson explained why he had decided to end his life. Her hand shook as she read it. But for the first time, she understood exactly what Jackson had been going through. The neurologist from Columbia University Medical Center had diagnosed Jackson with a rare disorder called hyperacusis, also referred to as DST, or decreased sound tolerance. Its defining symptom is the exact opposite of most hearing afflictions. With hyperacusis, instead of sounds being muffled or faint, they are painfully loud. It's like an inverse form of deafness. And once the hyperacusis is full-blown, all sounds are transmitted at maximum volume. Quiet sounds are loud sounds are loud. There's no variation, no escape, no cure. Even worse, doctors have no idea what actually causes it. The only shared trait among most patients is a sustained exposure to noise. People with jobs that require them to be around loud sounds for longer than average are at the highest risk. For instance, construction workers, concert staff, and musicians. But most people who are exposed to lots of noise do not get hyperacusis. If anything, they lose hearing over time. Not all cases of hyperacusis are equally painful. Some describe theirs as just uncomfortable and not debilitating. But in Jackson's suicide note, he wrote that his hyperacusis had turned his life into a torment. It had imprisoned him in his body and rendered him unable to enjoy anything. And ultimately, it broke him. It's still unknown exactly how rare hyperacusis really is. The American Tinnitus Association estimates that around 50 million Americans, or 15% of the US population, have experienced tinnitus, which is some form of ringing in their ears. The Hyperacusis Network estimates that about 1 in 1,000 people with tinnitus will also develop hyperacusis. However, for most people who develop this, it is unpleasant but manageable. But for a select, unfortunate few, the pain is unbearable. Its rarity makes it harder for doctors to diagnose and harder for patients to understand or to explain to the people in their lives. Jackson's story still is not understood. Thousands of musicians perform much louder than he did for decades without medical consequences. So it's not just a matter of using earplugs. The fragile inner workings of the ear remain one of the body's great mysteries. Sadly, Jackson's story serves as a reminder that despite how far modern medicine has come, there's still a long way to go. On the night of October 12, 1984, 20-year-old Angela Samoda eagerly picked up her telephone and dialed her boyfriend's number. But after he picked up and they spoke for just a few minutes, Angela's smile on her face faded quickly, and while she didn't exactly slam the phone receiver back onto its cradle, she did put it down with more force than she needed to. Angela actually really liked her boyfriend, and even now, after 10 months of dating, her heart beat faster whenever she thought of him. Handsome Ben McCall, already a few years out of college and already a construction project supervisor. But still, Angela couldn't help feeling really disappointed that he had just said no to her invitation to go out with her that night. Angela knew Ben had to be at work very early the next morning, but it wasn't exactly a common occurrence for her to ask him to do things like this, because most Friday nights and Saturday and Sunday nights, Angela was cooped up in her off-campus condo studying. Angela was a third-year student at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and she was enrolled as a double major in the school's highly competitive electrical engineering and computer science programs. Her goal was to use her degree to break into the heavily male-dominated world of engineering. And to ensure her dream became a reality, she had decided early on in her collegiate career to always put academics ahead of her social life. However, this did not mean Angela lacked a social life or that she was an antisocial person. Quite the opposite, in fact. Even though she lived off campus, Angela was the social chairperson of her college sorority. A sorority is a women's organization on a college campus whose purpose is to create a sense of community and friendship. And she was known among her big circle of friends not only for her intelligence and academic achievements, but also for her cheerful attitude and great sense of humor. Within her sorority, Angela was also known for always taking the time to regularly check in with her sorority sisters, chatting, asking how things were going, whether there was anything she could do to help people out. Angela was also strikingly beautiful. She was about 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slender build. She had dark blonde, thick hair, blue eyes, a radiant smile, and she always looked fit and athletic. Angela was actually so attractive that not long ago, it had created a very uncomfortable situation for her. One of her admirers, a fellow college student, had begun just shamelessly following her around campus and leaving notes on her car windshield saying that he wanted to be part of her life. But in truth, that situation had actually worried Angela's sorority sisters much more than it worried Angela, because Angela just had a lot of faith in her own ability to take care of herself. Now, as Angela stood in her kitchen and rapped her fingers on the counter next to the telephone, she suddenly decided she would just give her boyfriend one more call. Maybe she could change his mind about going out that night. After all, this was not just any Friday night. This was the day before one of the biggest sporting events in Texas. It was the annual rivalry game between the University of Texas and the University of Oklahoma. And it was being played right there in Dallas at the world-famous Cotton Bowl Stadium at the world-famous Texas State Fair. That night in Dallas, thousands of people, college students, alumni, residents, and tourists, would be out in force, enjoying the state fair, packing the local bars and nightclubs and restaurants, and gearing up for the next day's big game. But as Angela went to reach for the phone to call Ben back, she stopped herself and sighed. She knew Ben was not about to change his mind. During their call, Angela had told him that her friend, Anita Kadala, was going to be going out with them that night, meaning Ben knew he could turn down Angela's offer, and Angela would not be left stranded for the night. She would have Anita to still go out with. Also on their call, Angela had even pulled out the big guns and tried to make Ben a little jealous to see if maybe that would convince him to go. She had told him that if he was going to stay in, then maybe she would just give Russell a call to see if he wanted to tag along with her and Anita for the night. Russell was really just a friend, but he was a male friend. However, Ben had not been fazed and had just said, "Okay, sounds good, have fun." After sitting there for a moment, feeling totally annoyed and dejected, Angela suddenly sat up and thought, you know what, I will call Russell and see if he wants to go. So she went to her bedroom desk and rummaged around for the notebook where she kept her phone numbers. Once she found it, she turned to the Bees page, and there it was, Russell Buchanan. Russell, who was 23 years old, had graduated a year earlier from Texas A&M's School of Architecture, but Angela hoped that he still liked going to college parties and sporting events. Angela had met Russell during his senior year at a happy hour one night with a group of mutual friends. Russell had immediately been attracted to Angela and had asked for her phone number. They exchanged information, and a few days later, Russell had called Angela and invited her out to lunch. Angela had said yes, but later wound up canceling on Russell, and so they never actually went out on a date. With her phone book in hand, Angela walked back to her kitchen, picked up the telephone, and dialed Russell's number. Even if he wound up not wanting to go, at least this way, Angela could apologize for canceling on him on that one date. But when Russell picked up, he was all in on the idea of going out with Angela and Anita, and so he agreed to meet the girls later that evening. Not long after speaking to Russell, Anita arrived at Angela's condo, and after doing a little bit of studying and taking a quick nap, the girls began getting ready for the night. Before she and Anita left the condo, Angela took one last look at herself in the mirror. She was wearing one of her favorite outfits. It was a black silk jumpsuit with an open back and a pair of black high heels. She knew she looked her very best, but once again, she found herself wishing that it was Ben she was going out with. Turning away from her reflection, Angela picked up her black purse, she grabbed her car keys, and then she and Anita left the second-floor corner condo at 4944 Amesbury Drive. They headed down to the parking lot and hopped into Angela's Toyota Supra car. Angela was not a big drinker and had volunteered to drive them around that night. Angela turned on the car, she put it in drive, and then the two women drove the short distance to Russell's nearby apartment. After Russell climbed in the car around 9:30 p.m., the trio headed 10 miles south to their first stop of the evening, Bennigan's, a local bar known for its steak and ale. But Bennigan's was just a warm-up. By 11:30 p.m., Angela, Anita, and Russell had made their way first to the Boardwalk Beach Club, a singles bar that was popular for its 1950s and 60s style music, and then on to a nightclub in downtown Dallas called Nostromo's. Shortly after they arrived there, Angela, who now missed her boyfriend even more than she had before she left, decided she would just give him another call and see if maybe now he would want to join them. But after being awakened from his sleep, Ben was not any more inclined to come out and meet Angela. However, since Ben was a member of the club where they were at, Nostromo's, he called the front desk and got Angela and her friends access to their exclusive Rio room, which was the back room of the club. Angela still wished she could just have Ben, but the Rio room was a pretty good consolation prize. And so Angela spent the next hour or so dancing inside of this VIP area with Russell and Anita, and then when she wasn't dancing, she was walking from table to table saying hello to all the folks who were in there. According to Anita, it seemed like Angela knew literally everyone at the club that night. By 12:30 a.m., Angela was feeling tired, so she flagged down Anita and Russell and signaled that she wanted to leave. Angela had plans to get up early the next day and actually leave Dallas before the big crowds descended on the Cotton Bowl Stadium. she wasn't going to stick around for the big Texas versus Oklahoma game. Instead, she and some of her sorority sisters had decided to drive 100 miles south to Waco, Texas, to watch the football game between their own school, Southern Methodist University, and Baylor University. When Angela, Anita, and Russell left Nostromos and stepped back out onto the street, the crowd outside, and really all around Dallas, was just as thick and rowdy as it had been earlier in the evening. The three friends made their way through the crowd to Angela's car that was parked in the outdoor lot across the street, and then about 15 minutes later, Angela pulled up in front of Russell's apartment. Before he went inside, he walked around and gave Angela a long hug, and then when Angela climbed back inside of the car with Anita, Anita looked at her and just rolled her eyes. Anita had had a great time that evening, but more than once when Russell was dancing with Angela in the Rio room, Anita had definitely felt like she was just a third wheel. Angela just laughed it off and said Russell was a friend, and then they pulled away from the curb and kept on driving. By 1:15 a.m., Angela had arrived outside of Anita's dorm room. Angela had asked Anita to stay with her at her condo, but Anita had politely declined. The women hugged and said they'd talk tomorrow. Then Anita went inside of her building, and Angela hopped back inside of her car and then pulled away from the curb and began driving back home. But as Angela drove, she made a sudden decision to swing by Ben's apartment, which happened to be right on the way. Maybe if she just appeared on his doorstep, he might invite her to stay. But that did not happen. When Ben finally opened his front door looking totally groggy and disheveled, he was not pleased to see Angela standing there. After a brief chat, he told her that as nice as it was to see her, he really just needed to sleep, so could she please just head home and they could talk tomorrow. Angela would eventually accept defeat and would turn around and head back down the steps towards the street below. After Ben watched his girlfriend climb back into her car and drive off, he turned around and went back inside and climbed back into his bed. But just 15 minutes later, at about 1:45 a.m., right as Ben was finally dozing off again, he heard his phone ring. Groaning, he rolled over and picked up the receiver, already knowing that it had to be Angela, and it was. But this time, something was very different. She was not playfully trying to convince him to come see her. Instead, her voice sounded strained. Something was wrong. She was calling from inside of her condo, and her first words to Ben were both strange and distracted. "Ben," Angela said, "talk to me." And when Ben heard a sudden noise in the background and the sound of a voice calling out a question, Ben's anxiety flared. "Angie," he said, "are you okay?" Angela hesitated for a second, and then, still speaking in that sort of distracted and disjointed voice, she said, "I let a man into my condo." Before Ben could respond to this, he heard the sound of utensils clattering on the kitchen counter very close to the telephone, and Angela suddenly telling him in a rushed voice that she would call him back in just a few minutes before she suddenly hung up the receiver without even saying goodbye. By now, Ben was wide awake, and when a few minutes went by and Angela did not call him back, Ben dialed her number and got no answer. As he jumped out of bed and started pulling on his clothes, he called a second time, and again there was no answer. Now, Ben felt a flash of panic, and still pulling on his jacket, he ran outside and he jumped into his truck. Although portable cell phones wouldn't be a thing until the 1990s, as a construction supervisor, Ben's truck was equipped with a satellite phone. And as he made the 8 to 10 minute drive to Angela's condo, Ben used that satellite phone to call Angela's number again and again, but still there was no answer. Once Ben pulled into the parking lot of Angela's condo building, Ben saw Angela's car in its usual space. He parked his truck not far from her vehicle, and then he leapt out of his truck and ran to the stairs to Angela's front door, where he began to press her doorbell while also banging on the door and calling out her name. When no one answered or came to the door, Ben turned and ran back down the stairs and around the building to another flight of stairs that led up to Angela's balcony and where her back door was. When he got up to that door, he began banging on it and calling out Angela's name again. But again, there was no answer. Ben would eventually leave the back door and run back to his truck out front, where he would use his satellite phone to call 911. At 2:17 a.m., the emergency dispatcher who received Ben's 911 call sent a couple of officers out to do a welfare check at 4944 Amesbury Drive. The dispatcher told the police officers that a young man named Ben McCall was worried something bad had happened to his girlfriend, Angela Samoda, who lived at that address. When the two police officers arrived at the scene 23 minutes later, they found Ben sitting quietly on the back steps leading up to Angela's condo. To that point, the two responding officers had spent that whole night and the early morning hours answering lots of complaints of noise and drunkenness and disturbance, as all of Dallas seemed to be out on the streets partying. And so, tired and at the end of their shift, they were confident that this call would be no more serious than all the others they had been to so far. After directing Ben to go get the master key from the on-site building manager, the police officers walked around to the front of the property to knock on the door, and to double-check that the condo really was locked. It was locked, and after they knocked, no one answered, but a few minutes later, Ben arrived with the master key. With Ben waiting outside on the sidewalk, the police officers used the master key to open Angela's front door, and then they stepped inside. And almost immediately, the officers knew that this call was not like the others they'd responded to that night. On the carpeted floor of the living room just ahead of them, they could see there was a single black high-heeled shoe tipped over on its side, and near it was what looked like the track of another spike heel that had been dragged through the soft pile of the rug, like someone was still wearing that second high heel when they were dragged across the living room. After seeing this, both officers reflexively put their shooting hands down on their gun holsters. One of them, a rookie officer named Janice Crowther, who had just joined the Dallas police force 1 year earlier, immediately felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up when she saw those two shoes. Turning around and looking out the front door, motioning Ben to stay where he was, Janice turned back and stepped into the living room for a closer look, while her partner turned left and headed for what looked like a bedroom door. A minute later, as Janice was looking around the living room and not really seeing anything, she heard her partner calling out, "I think I found her." In the 31 years that Officer Crowther would go on to serve in the Dallas police force, she would never see a crime scene any more brutal than the one that met her eyes when she stepped into Angela's bedroom. Inside, Angela Samoda was lying on her back. While the upper part of her body was still on the mattress, her long, tanned legs dangled off the edge of the bed, not quite touching the floor. Her naked body was covered in blood, and it was clear right away that she had been the victim of an incredibly violent attack. The officers immediately rushed over to her and checked for a pulse, but Angela was deceased. After making sure the attacker was no longer in the condo, police radioed for an ambulance, crime technicians, and a team of homicide detectives. Within minutes, the street outside of Angela's condo, as well as her building's inside parking lot, became the scene of police cars and flashing lights as officers quickly cordoned off Angela's unit with yellow crime scene tape. 30 minutes later, lead detective Virgil Sparks and his partner Russell Graves were standing in Angela's bedroom looking at the ruined remains of a young woman who just hours before had had a vibrant life and a promising future. Their first impression was that this murder had been a crime of intense passion. In violent cases like this, where there was no sign of robbery, police knew from their experience that the motives were often rage, jealousy, love, revenge, or some combination of those. Detectives would need to wait for confirmation from the crime scene techs and the results of Angela's autopsy, but it certainly looked to them like Angela had been the victim of a violent sexual assault. And since there was no sign of forced entry, it also looked like Angela herself had opened the door to her attacker. From the defensive wounds on Angela's hands and arms, and the single high-heeled shoe that was still lying in the middle of the living room, detectives also surmised that there must have been a struggle, and that Angela had likely tried to fight off her attacker. And from the smears of blood on the bedroom light switch, and the bloody residue around the drain in the bathtub, and on the bottom of the shower curtain, it also appeared that after killing Angela, her attacker had used her bathroom to try to clean themselves off before leaving the condo and taking the murder weapon with them. Feeling sure that the killer had to be someone who knew Angela, the first people that the police wanted to talk to were the men in Angela's life, starting with Ben. If it was true that Angela had called Ben at 1:45 a.m., when, according to Ben, she sounded distracted and in trouble, which had prompted him to go check on her at her condo. And given that Ben called 911 at 2:17 a.m., then the murder had to have occurred during those intervening 32 minutes. If the killer wasn't Ben, then that meant Ben had just magically arrived at the condo within minutes of the killer making their getaway. It just seemed too convenient for Ben. So the detectives believed Ben had to be involved, or at least know something about what happened. His proximity to the crime and connection to the victim was just impossible to ignore. 30 minutes later, Ben was sitting across from the detectives in the interrogation room at the Dallas police station. And the thing detectives noticed about Ben right away was his very unemotional response to what had just happened to his girlfriend. Ben just kind of sat there quietly as if nothing had happened. So when Ben again brought up the phone conversation he'd had with Angela at 1:45 a.m., when she sounded scared and she said that she let a man into her condo, the investigators were just not necessarily buying it. They felt like maybe Ben was making this call up. So the detectives focused their follow-up questions not so much on this call at 1:45 a.m., but on whether Ben had been jealous that Angela had gone out that night with Russell and not him, and whether maybe Ben was just angry because maybe he suspected that Angela had other men she was seeing romantically besides him. But Ben swore he had nothing to do with the murder, and even though he would refuse to take a lie detector test, he would agree to give blood and saliva samples as well as scrapings from underneath his fingernails. He also agreed to let officers search his truck and condo and access his phone records. By later that same morning, police had 3 more names of possible suspects. Angela's sorority sisters had told them about a former boyfriend named Lance Johnson from Angela's hometown of Amarillo, Texas, who had once threatened Angela with a knife and who still called Angela wanting to get back together. The police also had the name of Joseph Patrick Barlow, the Southern Methodist University student who had been known to follow Angela around campus and leave notes on her car windshield, along with writing love poems to her. And then there was Russell, the young architect who had spent the evening with Angela and Anita, and who had asked Angela out on at least one date and had been stood up by her at least one time. But that afternoon, on October 13th, as police were getting ready to follow up with each of these men, they received a critical piece of new information that would change everything. The preliminary results from Angela's autopsy had come back, and she had indeed been sexually assaulted, and her attacker had left behind plenty of bodily fluids, including semen, which meant her attacker was a male. But a test of those bodily fluids showed something unique. It would turn out the man who attacked Angela was what's known as a non-secretor. A non-secretor is an individual, man or woman, whose blood type antigens do not show up in bodily fluid other than blood. In other words, their saliva or semen or other fluid secretions do not contain any markers of their blood type. Approximately 50 to 80% of all people are secretors, while 20 to 50% are non-secretors. And so this information immediately allowed police to start ruling suspects out. Today, police use DNA testing to track bodily fluids back to an exact individual. But back in 1984, when Angela was murdered, this kind of rough sorting of suspects using information like whether they were a secretor or not was about as good as police were going to get. So, with the non-secretor news, coupled with bulletproof alibis, the list of suspects suddenly dropped from 4 names down to just 1. Not only was Angela's potentially violent and jealous former boyfriend, Lance, a secretor rather than a non-secretor, he was also asleep in his parents' house in Amarillo, Texas, on the night of Angela's murder. And although the student who had followed Angela around campus would turn out to fit the bill as a non-secretor, he too had a rock-solid alibi that ruled him out. That left 2 suspects, Angela's boyfriend Ben and Russell Buchanan. And while Ben had seemed very much like the number 1 suspect, the search of his truck and apartment had turned up nothing, and phone records placed him far enough from the scene at the suspected time of Angela's death that police doubted he had the time to commit the murder. He also was eventually proven to be a secretor. Russell, on the other hand, was a non-secretor, and he had been with Angela right before she was killed. And his apartment was only a 5-minute walk from her condo. But what really snagged the police's interest in Russell was the fact that when investigators went to his apartment to interview him on October 13th, just hours after Angela's body had been discovered, Russell was nowhere to be found. In fact, it wasn't until Monday, October 15th, more than 48 hours after Angela's murder, that police finally found Russell at his home. And when Russell answered their knock on his door, he found a shotgun pointed directly at his chest. It wasn't exactly a raid, but it was clear to Russell that he was in some serious trouble. With the shotgun still aimed at his chest, detectives ordered Russell to go with them to the police station to answer questions about the murder of Angela Samoda. Once they were in the interrogation room, Russell told the detectives that he had nothing to do with Angela's murder. He said he didn't even know she had been killed until the police were at his door that morning with a shotgun pointed at him. He said the last time he saw Angela was when she and her friend Anita had dropped him off at 1 a.m. after the three of them had left the club. He told police that he was never involved romantically with Angela and that he knew she had a boyfriend and he was not jealous. When asked why he wasn't around on the 13th and 14th, Russell said he'd been at a wedding in Dallas before flying to Houston, Texas to visit his parents, and he had only just gotten back late on the 14th. Russell's story seemed plausible, but he didn't really have an alibi, and he was a non-secretor, so investigators could not rule him out as a suspect. However, without any other hard evidence that actually linked Russell to the crime scene or to Angela's death, Detective Sparks and Graves had to let Russell go. Over the next few weeks, 6 investigators, who were all assigned full-time to Angela's case, chased down every lead they possibly could. They interviewed everyone from friends and family to the mechanics who worked on Angela's car to the workers who had installed the carpeting in Angela's condo, but no one had any useful information. Crime Stoppers, a community program that encourages people to provide anonymous tips about crimes, featured Angela's case in a televised program and even offered a reward of $1,000 for any useful information. Also, Angela's own family offered a reward of $10,000 for information that would lead to her killer. But still, nothing came in. And as every lead seemed to go cold, Detective Virgil Sparks couldn't help but keep coming back to one name on his suspect list: Russell Buchanan. Russell had not been ruled out yet, and in Detective Sparks' eyes, Russell just seemed like the guy. And soon, one of Angela's friends, Sheila Gibbons, would become Detective Sparks' unlikely ally in his effort to uncover incriminating evidence against Russell. 22-year-old Sheila Gibbons was especially traumatized by Angela's death. Not only were the women both members of the same sorority, but also Sheila had been Angela's roommate during Angela's first year at Southern Methodist University. When they first met, it had seemed like the two girls did not have much in common. Sheila struggled with dyslexia, a learning disability that made it hard for her to correctly interpret words. And so while Sheila struggled with her studies and preferred socializing to books, Angela was the opposite. But over time, these differences actually seemed to draw the girls closer together. Sheila made sure that Angela didn't just study, and Angela helped Sheila focus on schoolwork. Even after Angela had moved into her own condo off campus, the women had remained very close. And just 1 week before Angela's murder, the two of them had had one of their regular get-togethers to catch up and chat about what was going on in their lives. On the weekend that Angela was killed, Sheila had been away from the university visiting her mother in North Texas, and that was where she was when she got a call from one of her sorority sisters who broke the terrible news. Sheila was completely devastated, and as soon as she got back to the campus, she went straight to the Dallas police station to see if there was anything she could do or tell them that would help in their investigation into Angela's death. And it was there at the station that Sheila happened to look over and see some of the crime scene photos of Angela right after she had been raped and murdered. And it was a sight Sheila could just never forget. After speaking with Detective Sparks and getting the impression that he was especially suspicious of Russell, Sheila offered to arrange and record conversations between herself and Russell in hopes that Russell might tell her something incriminating. And on top of Sheila spying on Russell, police also set up 24-hour-a-day surveillance on Russell, and they also pulled him in for questioning on dozens of occasions, picking him up at his work or at his apartment or anywhere in between. But all of that came to a screeching halt in April of 1984 when Russell hired a well-known defense attorney who told police they had to either charge Russell with a crime or leave him alone. And because at that point police still had not unearthed any hard evidence against Russell, they were forced to just leave him alone. And so Russell became yet another dead end. And by the late spring of 1985, the Angela Samota murder investigation had basically gone ice cold. And around the same time that investigators set Angela's files aside and changed the status of her case from active to suspended pending new information, Angela's friend and Detective Sparks' unofficial spy, Sheila, really started to struggle. Angela's unsolved killing had shattered Sheila's sense of safety and security, along with her belief in the justice system. Convinced that Russell had just gotten away with murder, and still feeling totally traumatized by the brutality of her friend's murder, Sheila would drop out of Southern Methodist University in the middle of her senior year. For a while after she left school, Sheila just sort of drifted through her life, overwhelmed by the sense of numbness that Angela's murder had caused. Eventually, in 1986, Sheila would meet a man named Charles Wasaki, they would get married, they would buy a house together, and they would have kids together. And for the most part, Sheila was able to just kind of focus on her family and move on with her life and not let Angela's murder dominate every aspect of it. But all of that would change one evening in 2004. By then, Sheila was 43 years old and was living comfortably with her family in Nashville, Tennessee. And while she did still periodically think about her friend Angela, the thought of what happened to her was still so traumatic that often whenever Sheila thought of Angela, she tried to bury those feelings and not talk about them. But one night that year, as Sheila was sitting up in her bed alone, trying to complete some homework for a Bible study class, she happened to look up from her Bible, and what she saw at the foot of her bed shocked her. Standing there was her dead friend, Angela Samota. According to Sheila, Angela looked exactly as Sheila remembered her. From the clear blue eyes to the huge smile that used to light up the room, her friend was dressed in the same brown sweater and matching brown skirt that she had been wearing the last time she and Sheila had gotten together at Southern Methodist University to catch up on each other's lives. Even though Angela would vanish just a moment later, Sheila described that experience of seeing Angela standing there as a, quote, God nod, a message not from Angela, but directly from God, that it was time for Sheila to get out there and make sure Angela's murder case finally got solved. As Sheila lay there in bed, stunned by what had just happened, she thought back over all the advances in DNA testing that had been made over the last 20 years, and how every day it seemed like more criminals were being identified through the genetic traces they left behind, from their fingerprints to a stray hair or a drop of blood or saliva or semen. And so as she sat there, her sense of shock quickly gave way to a clear sense of purpose. She put her Bible down next to her, and then she reached over to the table and she grabbed the phone off the nightstand. A moment later, she was talking to an officer at the Dallas Police Department, asking to speak with the detective in charge of investigating Angela Samota's murder. And even though that call didn't net her any new information about the murder, that didn't stop Sheila from pursuing this God-given mission to solve her friend's murder. Over the next 12 months, Sheila would call the Dallas police station 781 times to request they do DNA testing in her friend's case to try to figure out who her killer was. But each time, the request was denied because the case was still cold, there were no new leads, and at this point, they didn't even think they had the original crime scene evidence anymore to test. And even if they did, DNA testing was very expensive, and for a case this old, it didn't seem worth it. Finally, after those 781 calls didn't work, Sheila decided to just get a private investigator's license. This way, she would have the professional credentials that would force the police to take her and her requests for DNA testing seriously. And in 2006, 2 years after Sheila had seen the vision of Angela in her bedroom, she finally started seeing real progress on Angela's case. That year, the Dallas police finally established a cold case department, and largely because of Sheila's rabid insistence over the years that they look into Angela's case, the first case this new department pulled for re-examination was Angela's. That year, working directly with Sheila, the detective handling Angela's case was able to track down the original physical evidence that had been collected at the crime scene, and they sent it off for DNA testing. Once the DNA analysis was finally completed, the results were entered into the Federal Bureau of Investigation's database of known and suspected criminals, but there was not an immediate match. However, investigators would continue to search that database, and finally, 2 years later in 2008, Sheila got a call from the Dallas police saying they had found a match, meaning they had finally discovered who killed Angela. And when they told Sheila who the killer was, she could not believe it. Based on the DNA analysis, along with other pieces of evidence and testimony, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Angela Samota. Back on the night of October 12, 1984, when Angela and her friends Anita and Russell were going from restaurant to restaurant and bar to bar having a good time, it didn't take long before Angela was drawing lots of admiring glances from men who were also at all of these establishments they were going to, especially when she and her friends stepped out onto the dance floor. Unlike a lot of the people who were out celebrating that night, Angela was drinking very little alcohol. As a result, her smile was genuine, her eyes were clear, and her movements were graceful and coordinated. The man who was sitting at one of the bars that night could hardly take his eyes off of this beautiful young woman in the black jumpsuit. And when Angela accidentally brushed up against him on her way to a table in the corner of that bar, this man felt a sudden thrill at the silky touch and warm scent of Angela's bare skin. It was then that he decided to follow her. He told himself that he just wanted to watch her, enjoy how good she looked, maybe just see where she lived and whether the boy she was with was also her boyfriend. So when Angela and Anita and Russell left the Nostromos Club at about 12:30 a.m., this man was waiting for them. He was standing just outside the exit to the club, maybe a few feet off to the side, so as not to be too conspicuous. Although this man was over 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 260 pounds, so he was enormous, and so trying to remain anonymous had always been a big challenge for him. But luckily, that night, the street was so crowded with drunk people that he hoped this beautiful girl and her 2 friends would not notice him. And when Angela and her friends emerged from the club, they didn't. They just walked right past him without a second look. The big man waited a few seconds to let them walk a little bit farther into the crowd, and then he put his hands in his pockets, he put his head down, and he began secretly walking behind the 3 friends. The trio would push past the big crowd out into the street, they would cross over to the other side, and they would make their way to the parking lot where they climbed into Angela's Toyota Supra. By the time Angela had turned her car on and began backing out of her parking spot, the big man who had followed them was now sitting only a few spots away in his idling vehicle. As Angela put her car into gear and began driving out of the parking lot, the big man put his car into drive and then eased his foot off the brake and slowly hit the gas. It wasn't long before the big man felt another thrill. At the first stop Angie made, that was the name he'd overheard her friends call her, the young man who had been with them got out. He hugged Angie and then made his way into the nearby condo building. Meaning, even if that young man was Angie's boyfriend, he wasn't going to be spending the night with her. A few minutes later, the big man could hardly contain his excitement when Angie stopped again, this time at a college dormitory where she said goodbye to her other friend, the girl. Angie was now all alone. But the big man's smile faded when Angie's third stop took her to an apartment where she knocked on the front door. This couldn't be her own place, or she would have just used a key and walked in. A minute later, an outside light switched on, and the big man saw another young man open the door, and a moment later, Angie had stepped inside and the door had shut behind them. So that was it, the big man thought, at least for tonight. That young man who had just opened the door must be Angie's real boyfriend, and she is going to spend the night with him. The big man suddenly realized how tightly he was gripping the steering wheel, and he took a few minutes to force himself to just breathe and relax. But even as he was getting ready to turn his car back on and drive home, the door to this apartment opened again, and he saw Angie step back outside, her blonde hair shining like a halo in the porch light. Watching intently from his car, the big man held his breath, then let out a sigh of relief when the young man inside the apartment stepped back inside and closed the door. Angie was alone again. Breathing a little faster now, the big man in the car watched as Angie walked back to her Toyota. She unlocked the door, slipped once more behind the steering wheel, turned on the engine, and pulled back out onto the road. She never noticed the car that pulled out behind her and followed her the rest of the way home. 10 minutes later, Angie was climbing the steps to her condo on Amesbury Drive. The big man had parked his car on the other side of the street and made a mental note of which unit was hers. He had made up his mind. He was going to go inside. But it was important that he got to her right now before she was settled in her bed. So, after taking a deep breath, the big man looked around him to make sure no one was watching. Then he climbed out of his car, he shut the door quietly, and began walking across the street toward Angela's building. Once she was inside of her condo, Angela put down her purse and hung up her car keys. But just as Angela was about to slip out of her black high heels and head for the bathroom, she heard a sudden but quiet knock on the door just a few feet away from where she was standing. Then she heard a man's voice and more knocking, still quiet but insistent. Whoever was out there sounded apologetic and kind of embarrassed, and so Angela stepped closer to the door and just listened. The man outside began talking again. He said he just needed to find out where the nearest payphone was. He'd just take a second or two of her time. Please, could you just open up the door? Reassured by the tone of his voice, Angela reached out and she unlocked the door. But then, before she could even turn the door handle, the man outside had pushed the door open himself and was now stepping into her condo. Forced backward, Angela felt a sudden rush of fear. The man in front of her was enormous, and he had these small, flat green eyes and a thin mouth. And as soon as he was inside of her condo, he just started repeating his question about the payphone while also simultaneously turning around, shutting her door behind them, and locking both of them inside of her condo. Then, with the door locked, he turned back around and faced her and began slowly walking toward her while asking if he could use her bathroom. For just a second, Angela squeezed her eyes shut, trying to gather her thoughts and find a way to make him leave her condo. And then she thought of Ben. What she needed to do was call Ben. This huge man would never hurt her if he knew that she'd told her boyfriend that he was here in the condo with her. So, as Angela forced herself to open her eyes and face the big man who was bearing down on her, she also reached out for the phone on the kitchen counter and quickly punched in Ben's number. The man didn't try to stop her from using the phone. He just continued walking closer and closer to her while asking, "Where's your bathroom? Where's your bathroom?" With the phone up to her ear, Angela quickly gestured to the intruder with her other hand toward a tiny hallway on the other side of the living room where the bathroom was located. As the big man suddenly turned away from her and began striding toward that hallway, Ben answered Angela's call. Right away, Angela began speaking, doing her best to stay calm, but her voice sounded strange and disjointed. "Ben," she said, "talk to me, please." And in the seconds that followed, Angela kind of awkwardly explained that she had just allowed a man into her apartment and he's using the bathroom and he's asking about a payphone, and did Ben know if there was a payphone near her condo? Maybe if the intruder knew where the payphone was, he'd just leave. But before Angela could explain anything else, the big man emerged from that hallway near the bathroom and strode right back over to Angela and again began asking her over and over again, "Where's your bathroom? Where's your bathroom?" The big man was now so close to Angela that the only way to put distance between her and him was to hang up the phone and back up. And so Angela quickly told Ben she'd call him back in a few minutes, and then she dropped the receiver onto its cradle. But before Angela could step away, the big man had taken one of the knives out of her butcher block on the kitchen counter, and even as Angela tried to turn and run toward the front door to escape, The big man lunged and he grabbed her with one arm around the waist and began pulling her away from the door. Angela did her best to fight back, but her attacker was way bigger and stronger than she was, and so a moment later she was being forcibly dragged across her living room towards her bedroom. After throwing her onto her bed, the big man climbed on top of her and then pressed down hard with his left hand over her mouth and face to stifle her screams. Then he violently raped her. After he was done, with his hands still pressed down over her mouth, he straddled her torso with one knee on either side of her, making sure she couldn't move. Then, with his free right hand, he reached over and he grabbed the knife he had taken from the kitchen that was sitting on the bedside table. Then, while staring straight down at Angela's wide eyes, the man raised the knife in his right hand over his head, and then he brought it straight down with all of his strength into the center of Angela's chest. Angela tried to buck him off, but seconds later he had pulled the knife out of her and then drove it back down again into a new spot in her chest. And he would do this over and over and over again, 18 total times. The force of these blows were so great that they broke Angela's breastbone, and even though the knife may have been as short as 2 inches long, it would go straight through Angela's heart and then come out of her back. And every time this huge man who was crouched over her like a monster raised the knife again to strike, a spray of blood left a thickening trail on the headboard and wall behind Angela and coated her face and body with droplets, except where the killer's left hand covered her mouth and where his enormous body covered her bruised and naked skin. Janice Crowther, one of the police officers who first discovered Angela's body early in the morning of October 13, 1984, would later testify at the killer's trial that when she first walked into Angela's bedroom, it looked like Angela's heart had been cut out and was laying on top of her chest. It would turn out Angela's killer was a 36-year-old convicted serial rapist named Donald Bess, who had targeted Angela simply because he liked the way it felt when she accidentally bumped into him at the bar. That was all it took. Angela didn't know him, and he didn't know her. Angela was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Donald was already an experienced predator when he first came in contact with Angela. He'd gotten out of prison on parole just 6 months earlier in March of 1984 after serving only 6 years of a 25-year-long sentence for rape, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. Although he was living and working in Houston, Donald had made the 240-mile drive north to Dallas several times that summer and fall to visit friends and to meet women at local bars. 9 months after getting away with the rape and murder of Angela Samota, Donald would go on to rape, but not kill, yet another Texas woman. However, this time he was caught, and in 1985 he was sentenced to 999 years in prison, however, again with the possibility of parole. But in April of 2008, the DNA testing that Sheila had wanted the Dallas police force to do for so many years finally paid off when the DNA at Angela's crime scene matched Donald Bess's DNA. On June 18, 2010, Donald Bess was convicted of capital murder in the rape and stabbing death of Angela Samota, and he would be sentenced to death. Now 74 years old, Donald is still on death row at Polunsky Prison in Livingston, Texas. While there is no execution date as of now, Donald will never be eligible for parole. As for Sheila, when she finally heard the name of Angela's real killer back in 2008, she was shocked. For more than 20 years, she had completely believed that Angela's killer was Russell Buchanan. In February of 2012, Sheila met with Russell in Dallas to apologize for her attempt back in 1984 to connect him to Angela's murder, and her belief in the years that followed that he was the guilty party. Now a well-known and successful architect in Dallas, Russell was quick to forgive. In the end, Sheila's persistence had not only led to the discovery of Angela's real killer, but it had also finally lifted the cloud of suspicion Russell had been living under for more than 2 decades. Sheila is still a practicing private investigator. Her specialty is cracking cold cases. In 1998, the Barber family was living a charmed life. Michael and Elizabeth had been happily married for 20 years, and they had 3 beautiful daughters who ranged in age from 9 to 15, and they were all thriving. The family lived in a very modest, plain-looking home in Melbourne, Australia, but the second you stepped foot inside of that home, you would see it was bursting with life. The sounds of kids laughing and playing, and of Michael and Elizabeth happily chatting away filled every room. Now, the Barbers' lives were not perfect by any means. In fact, they struggled financially and lived basically paycheck to paycheck. However, they didn't let their financial struggles define them. Instead, Michael and Elizabeth put a lot of stock in another aspect of their lives that they were all undeniably rich in, and that was in creativity. Michael was a toy maker and a designer, and Elizabeth worked in children's literature. And each of the 3 Barber children were beginning to cultivate their own unique creative gifts. At 9 years old, Heather, who was the youngest, had developed a lovely singing voice. Ashley Rose, who was the middle child at 11 years old, had learned to play the flute. But the Barbers' oldest daughter, 15-year-old Rachel, was really the star of the family. In fact, they called her that, Rachel Star. Rachel was an extremely talented dancer. She was so graceful and stylish that even when she was just walking around, it almost looked like she was dancing. Rachel was also very beautiful, with big emerald green eyes and fair skin, and she had this effortless charisma that just drew people to her. From the outside, Rachel really did look like the kid who had everything going for her, but like the rest of us, Rachel had her own struggles, like she was not a natural student. No matter how hard she tried, math and science just seemed impossible to her. And Rachel had a number of acute fears that really made certain aspects of her life very challenging. She was deathly afraid of the dark, she was afraid of talking to strangers, she was afraid of navigating the public transportation system on her own, and even just the thought of going into a store by herself filled her with immense dread. As a result of having these fears, Rachel was actually very dependent on her parents. Her mother, Elizabeth, would jokingly say that Rachel was 15, going on 18, going on 12. Eventually, when Rachel's anxieties and fears, combined with her struggles with traditional schoolwork, put her into a bit of a depression, her parents decided they needed to step in and take action. They wanted their Rachel Star to be happy. They wanted to encourage her and nurture her strengths. And the thing that they knew she loved the most and was the best at was dance. So in September of 1998, Michael and Elizabeth allowed Rachel to drop out of her traditional school and transfer to a full-time dance school in Richmond, which was an inner-city suburb of Melbourne located about 20 minutes away from the Barber's house. And once Rachel was enrolled in this new dance school, she blossomed. She made loads of new friends, she started modeling, which was something she was very proud of, and she met a boy, Manny, who she absolutely adored. But as well as things seemed to be going for Rachel at her new school, she would soon make a fateful decision that would have absolutely catastrophic effects. On Monday, March 1st of 1999, so 5 months after Rachel had transferred to this new dance school, Rachel and her father, Michael, like every other morning, left the Barber household, climbed into Michael's car, and began driving to Wattle Park, which was a train station closest to their house. From Wattle Park, Rachel would catch a train that would take her to the Richmond station, and then she would get off, she would meet up with a friend, they would have breakfast, and they would walk the rest of the way to their dance school. When Michael pulled into the parking lot at Wattle Park and parked the car, and Rachel was getting her stuff to climb out of the vehicle to head up to the train, he stopped his daughter and said, "Hey, remember, I'll be back here at 6:15 tonight to pick you up." And Rachel looked at him, she smiled and said, "Okay," and then she hopped out of the car and she pranced her way over to the station. Michael watched his daughter just long enough to see her climb the steps and disappear, at which point he put his car back in drive, he left the lot, and he headed back home. That evening, Michael returned to Wattle Park. But at 6:15 p.m., when the train came rolling into the station, Rachel was not on board. Michael assumed his daughter must have been running late and so missed the train she would always take, and so he just sat in the parking lot and waited for the next train to come into the station. And a few minutes later, when it pulled into the station, Rachel was not on that train either. And so Michael, he was starting to get worried because he's looking outside, it's getting dark, he knows his daughter hates being out in the dark, she's afraid of being alone, and he's wondering, what's going on with her, but he keeps telling himself that she's bound to show up any minute. And so Michael just sat in this parking lot and watched train after train after train come through the station, and Rachel wasn't on any of them. Now, Michael didn't have a cell phone, and neither did Rachel, so he couldn't just call her to see where she was. But finally, after a few more trains came through and none of them contained his daughter, he left the parking lot but went to his parents' house, which was much closer than his own home. And he rushed inside and he grabbed their phone and he called back to his home. And when his wife, Elizabeth, Rachel's mom, picked up the phone, he immediately asked her, "Hey, is Rachel home? Did she get a ride home from one of her friends?" And Elizabeth would tell Michael, "No, she's not here and she hasn't called." This was the moment when Michael and Elizabeth instinctively knew something had to be wrong. Rachel was on time for everything, and if she was late, she would always call ahead or call afterwards and at least give some explanation. But to just go silent and not show up, that was not in character. And again, because it was pitch black outside and they knew she was probably alone, that was a situation they knew Rachel would never want to be in because it would have terrified her. And so Michael tells Elizabeth he's going to come home as fast as he can. They hang up. And then while Elizabeth is waiting for her husband to return, she picked the phone right back up and she dialed Manny's number. That's Rachel's boyfriend. She figured maybe Rachel was with Manny, or at the very least, maybe she checked in with Manny because most nights Rachel and Manny spoke on the phone. But when Manny picked up the phone, he would tell Elizabeth that he hasn't seen Rachel since earlier in the day, and she has not called him, which to him was odd. He kind of expected her to give her a call that evening. When Elizabeth asked Manny, what was my daughter doing when you were with her last? Manny would say, "Oh, we went out to a shopping mall near the school in Richmond, and we went to the shoe store, and Rachel actually walked up to a very particular set of shoes. They were these big platform blue chunky shoes, and she said that she was going to buy them the next day, and she was really excited about it." And Elizabeth, as she's hearing this, she knew exactly the shoes that Manny was describing, because just the day before, Rachel had taken her mom, Elizabeth, to the shoe store and pleaded with her to get those blue chunky platform shoes. But when Elizabeth had looked at the price tag, they were $100, and so they were too expensive. And so as Elizabeth is hearing Manny say that her daughter is talking about how she's going to buy these shoes the next day, Elizabeth is thinking, with what money? Rachel has no money. How could she possibly afford those shoes? And so she asked Manny, did Rachel say how she planned on affording those blue shoes? And Manny would say, actually, yeah, she told me that she had this secret job, but she wouldn't give me any more details about it. And she said that with the money from this secret job, she'd be able to buy these shoes. Manny would tell Elizabeth that Rachel really stressed that this secret job was nothing to worry about. It was nothing immoral. But as Elizabeth is listening to Manny tell her this, all her alarm bells are going off. She could not fathom any job that would require a 15-year-old girl to go out by herself at night doing something that was secret and give absolutely no information to her family. Every possibility just seemed bad. After hanging up the phone with Manny, Elizabeth began frantically calling all of Rachel's friends and acquaintances and different locations around town that she knew her daughter would frequent, but nobody had any information about where Rachel was. A little while later, Michael finally pulled into the driveway, and when he went inside, he talked to his wife briefly, but he could tell they had no new information, their daughter was still not home, this was becoming a crisis. And so very quickly, Michael just left the house, got right back into his car, and he drove to the police station. But when he got to the police station, the police didn't really offer the response that he was hoping for. From the police's perspective, it sounded like a teenage girl has been missing for a few hours, and so in their mind, they're thinking, one, that's not an emergency yet, and two, she probably just kind of ran off. Teenagers do that, they come back the next day, it's normal. And so despite Michael's pleas to the police that no, this is different, my daughter would never do that, she would never run away, this is totally out of character, despite all those pleas, the police said, look, Michael, just go home, wait, your daughter will be home soon, and if for some reason in the next few days she does not come back home, you come back and you tell us. And so Michael, now feeling totally devastated and terrified for his daughter's safety, finally did just leave the police station and he headed back home. And then he and his wife and his two other daughters had a terrible, restless night's sleep, wondering what was going on with Rachel. And then finally, when the sun came up the next morning, Michael and Elizabeth rushed out of their bedroom and headed into the kitchen, hoping, praying that Rachel would just magically be in their house again. But when they went into the kitchen, Rachel wasn't there. She had not come home. However, pretty early on this second day of Rachel's disappearance, Michael and Elizabeth would learn something new. Manny would get in touch with Michael and Elizabeth, and he would tell them that he remembered something Rachel had said during their final conversation the day before. She had told Manny that he had nothing to worry about with regards to this secret job because it wasn't immoral, it was totally safe, and, Manny said, Rachel said there was an old female friend who was going to be there at this job site in some way participating that would keep her safe. And so Michael and Elizabeth have no idea what to make of this old female friend, but in a way it was kind of a relief because they know their daughter is basically terrified to be alone, and so at least knowing wherever she was with this old friend, that made them feel good. But the parents' positivity about this new development quickly faded when they began calling around to all of Rachel's friends, both new and old, female and otherwise, and none of them were missing. Everybody was where they were supposed to be, and nobody knew anything about what happened to Rachel. The only intel the parents got from this round of calling all of her friends was that several of her friends said that the day before, the day Rachel disappeared, they had walked with Rachel back to the train station after school. And in fact, one of the friends told Michael and Elizabeth that they offered Rachel a ride home so that she wouldn't have to ride the train back home, but Rachel had turned it down, saying her father was going to be meeting her on the other end at Wattle Park at 6:15 p.m. The Barbers didn't know what to make of this. Did Rachel believe at the time that she could go do this secret job and still be back in time to meet her father at 6:15 at Wattle Park? Or did she lie to the friend who was offering the ride and make up the story that she planned on seeing her father when in reality she planned on ditching her father and going and doing this secret job for the night? But regardless of which of these things were true, the parents just still could not understand why by now, 24 hours later, their daughter still had not called to check in. Michael and Elizabeth found themselves wondering if they really knew their Rachel Starr as well as they thought they did. Maybe she had actually run away like the police suggested. The parents were totally distraught, they were totally anxious and terrified, and so with nothing else to do, over the next several days, they just continued to go out and look everywhere and talk to everyone to try to find where their daughter was. But everything they looked into turned into a dead end. Then, finally, on Monday, March 8th, so exactly 1 week since Rachel had disappeared, Michael and Elizabeth got a new lead. A girl named Allison, who had gone to a dance class with Rachel before Rachel had transferred schools, had overheard her younger sister talking about the Rachel Barber disappearance and how nobody had seen or heard from Rachel since 5:45 p.m. the previous Monday. Allison, who had not heard about Rachel's disappearance until this very moment, knew immediately she had to go forward and talk to police, because she actually saw Rachel on the night she disappeared, a full hour after her last known sighting. At 6:40 p.m. on the night Rachel disappeared, Allison was on the train car headed to Praron, which is a suburb located southeast of where Rachel lived. And when this train that Allison was on pulled into the Richmond station and the doors opened up, Allison watched as Rachel, along with this other girl who Allison didn't recognize, walked on board and then took seats right next to each other on the other end of the train away from Allison. Now, from Allison's perspective, immediately it was clear they were friends. They were laughing and joking together and just kind of in their own world. And so Allison didn't want to be rude, so she stopped staring at them, and they continued riding the train until they got to the Praron station, at which point Allison got up to leave the train. But as she did, she saw Rachel and this mystery girl. They also had stood up, and they were making their way out of the door. And as they were leaving, Rachel actually would look up and see Allison, and they would both smile and wave at each other. But that was it. And then Allison would watch as Rachel and her friend would leave ahead of her, and they would walk down the platform. And from Allison's perspective, it seemed obvious that Rachel and this girl were friends, and whatever they were going to go do, they were choosing to go do, and they were going to do together. When Michael and Elizabeth heard about this sighting of their daughter on the train and this mystery girl, on the one hand, it was kind of reassuring because it meant that Rachel was with this friend, potentially the old female friend that Rachel mentioned to Manny, and so whatever she was doing, at least she was not alone. But on the other hand, it begged the question of what role did this mystery person play in wherever Rachel was now? Had Rachel and this mystery girl gone to do this secret job together and then something happened to them? Or had this mystery girl been Rachel's accomplice and they had run off together like the police thought? Whatever the case was, the Barbers and the police at this point, who were looking much more seriously into the Barber case by now, they knew the next step was identifying this mystery girl. A couple of days later, on Thursday, March 11th, the police called in an artist to create a sketch of this mystery girl that Allison had seen on the train. Allison would describe this mystery girl as being older than Rachel, being heavier than Rachel, and very plain. That day, the police also ordered a trace on all of the phone calls going into the Barber residence on the day before she went missing, because they figured that if Rachel and this mystery girl were in cahoots on some sort of secret thing together, they likely communicated the day before. And when the phone call trace came back, there was one phone number in particular that stood out to police. There was a private phone number that called the Barber household twice on the day before Rachel disappeared. Once at 5:24 p.m., and that call lasted about 15 minutes, and then shortly after that call ended, the private number called back, and then there was another conversation that lasted about 30 minutes. It would take police another 24 hours, but eventually they would figure out who this private caller was. It was a 20-year-old woman named Caroline Robertson who very closely resembled the police sketch of the mystery girl that Allison had seen on the train, and it just so happened that Caroline Robertson lived very close to the Praron train station where Allison saw the mystery girl and Rachel get off. Additionally, Caroline was Rachel's old babysitter and was very close with the Barber family. And so it seemed very likely that Caroline was both the mystery girl on the train and the old female friend that Rachel had mentioned to Manny when she told him about this secret job. This new information was a huge relief. From Michael and Elizabeth's perspective and the police's perspective, it now seemed very likely that Rachel and Caroline had just snuck off together and were now probably hiding out at Caroline's apartment near the Praron train station. And so, believing they could put an end to this missing teenager drama that night, the police hopped in their cars and they drove over to Caroline's apartment. But when they got there at 5:25 p.m., they very quickly realized that things were not as they seemed. Police walked up to Caroline's front door and they knocked and began yelling out for Caroline and Rachel to come outside, but nobody yelled back and nobody opened the door. When they tried the handle, they found it was locked, so they got in touch with the property's real estate agent, who came out and gave them a set of spare keys, and when the police tried those keys, they found they still could not open the door because the door had been locked from the inside with a special latch. And so the police began walking around the perimeter of the building looking for another way inside. And as they're walking, one of the officers looks up and sees a second-floor window of the apartment is open, and it's open enough that clearly a person could slip inside. And so the police contacted the fire department, who showed up very quickly, and they put a ladder up against the side of the apartment that went up to that open window, and then a police officer began climbing up. And when he got up to the window and could look inside, he saw he was looking into a bedroom. And at first, it looked totally ordinary until he noticed there was a body lying face down at the foot of the bed on the ground. It was Caroline. The officer on the ladder immediately turned around and yelled for backup, and then he and other officers poured into the apartment, and before long, Caroline, who did actually still have a pulse, but she was totally unconscious and not responding, she was being rushed to the hospital. And while that was happening, the remainder of the officers who were on site, they all went into the apartment to try to find Rachel. And so as they're searching this apartment, which was totally messy, there was things everywhere, there were boxes everywhere, it almost looked like Caroline had been packing her apartment to move, potentially, when something happened to her, causing her to fall unconscious inside of her bedroom. And so the police searched this apartment top to bottom, and they did not find Rachel. In fact, there was no trace of Rachel anywhere, except they did find a bag of clothes that looked like they were Rachel's size, not Caroline's size, but it wasn't clear if those were actually Rachel's clothes. And so the police just kind of walked around the apartment, gathering up anything that seemed suspicious, like they found rubber gloves and hair dye, they found some bank receipts and some notebooks with some strange writing in them, and they just hoped that some of this stuff might lead to Rachel. Back at the hospital, Caroline had regained consciousness, and even though she was very disoriented and seemed kind of out of it, the medical staff allowed the police to come in right away and start asking questions because they knew time was of the essence with Rachel. They had to find her. And so the officers came into Caroline's room and they sat down, and the first question they asked her was, "Do you know where Rachel Barber is?" And Caroline just stood there kind of stunned for a second and then just said, "Yes." Over the next few months, as Caroline's memory came back into focus, she would piece together one of the most unbelievable stories that police in Melbourne had ever heard. The following is a reconstruction of that story based both on Caroline's testimony and on what police were able to actually fact-check. Back on Sunday, February 28th, 1999, so the day before Rachel vanished, Caroline called Rachel and offered her a job. Caroline told Rachel that she was working on this psychology study and she needed participants. However, the study was highly confidential, so if Rachel did want to be a part of it, she wouldn't be able to tell anyone what she was doing. However, the study was quite lucrative for Rachel, and it really didn't require much of Rachel. All Rachel had to do was meet Caroline the following day after school was over at the Richmond train station, and then the two of them would ride the train to Prahran, they would get off, make their way to Caroline's apartment, and there they would conduct this psychological study, and when it was over, Caroline would pay Rachel $100 and the cost of transportation. And so Rachel, she was thrilled at the idea because she wanted those beautiful blue shoes, and so she said yes. So the next day, Monday, March 1st, Rachel wrapped up school. She made her way to the Richmond train station. She connected with Caroline. They hopped on board the train. They made their way to Prahran with Allison spotting them on the train as they went. And then when they got off the train at Prahran, Caroline and Rachel would make their way to a nearby pizza shop and get a pizza and some beer. And then they would walk the rest of the way to Caroline's apartment. Once they were inside the apartment, Caroline led them upstairs to her bedroom, and then they both sat down on the floor at the foot of the bed and began eating their pizza and having some beer and just laughing and exchanging some stories. And then after their dinner was over, Caroline told Rachel it was time to start the study, and it began with a guided meditation. Sitting next to Rachel, Caroline told her to stay calm, think happy thoughts, close your eyes, and just begin to breathe in nice and slow, breathe out nice and slow, and just feel yourself breathing in and out. And so Rachel did as she was told and began breathing in and out and being very calm. And Caroline, at this point, she stood up and began kind of pacing around the room, watching Rachel periodically and reminding her to think happy thoughts and stay calm and keep just listening to herself breathe in and breathe out. And then at some point, Caroline just stopped and stood right in front of Rachel and just stared at her really intently. And at some point, Caroline was confident that the drugs she had laced in the pizza that she had given Rachel were starting to take an effect. It looked like Rachel was starting to doze off. And so at that point, Caroline walked around behind Rachel, who still had her eyes closed. She's still doing the study, and Caroline pulled out a telephone cord. She wrapped it around Rachel's neck, and she pulled it as tight as she could. Immediately, Rachel came out of her trance and she reached up and began trying to pull the cord off of her neck. But Caroline was easily 50 pounds heavier than Rachel and easily was able to maintain control over Rachel. And so Rachel is squirming and fighting and scratching and doing everything she can to try to get this cord off, but she can't. And eventually the fight just leaves her body and she goes still. Caroline would maintain tension on that cord to ensure Rachel was dead, but then eventually she would release the tension on the cord, at which point she would drag Rachel's body into a nearby closet and she would shut the door. 2 days later, Caroline would open that closet up and she would drag Rachel's body back out of the closet with the cord still wrapped around her neck, and she would roll Rachel's body up in a carpet and then stuff her inside of a large army duffel bag that Caroline had purchased for this exact reason, for disposing Rachel's body. And then she called a taxi who came to her apartment and she lugged Rachel's body still inside of this bag and dumped it in the taxi. And then she and Rachel's body and the taxi driver drove about an hour north to rural Kilmore, where Caroline's father had a vacation home. And there she would bury Rachel's body in a shallow grave next to one of her childhood pets. When Caroline had been rushed to the hospital because she was found unconscious in her bedroom by police, the assumption was she and probably Rachel had been attacked, and that was why Caroline was unconscious. But what really happened is Caroline was in her apartment and she saw the police show up, and it made her so stressed that it triggered a seizure, and that was why she passed out in her bedroom. When she came to in the hospital and people began asking her what happened, she would say that Rachel's death was an accident. However, months later, after investigators had gone through all of the evidence they had collected from Caroline's apartment, they discovered Rachel's death was anything but accidental. According to the notebooks they found all over Caroline's apartment, which were basically Caroline's journals, Caroline hated herself. She totally loathed her physical image and who she was, and she was obsessed with the girl she used to babysit, Rachel Barber. Rachel was this beautiful, perfect person that Caroline wished she could be. And so one day, Caroline decided she would just stop being Caroline and would literally become Rachel. And to do that, she would kill Rachel and assume her identity. The secret job, the psychology study that Caroline offered Rachel, was a very intentional trap. She knew Rachel wanted money for things like those blue shoes, and she knew Rachel would trust Caroline. Caroline was her babysitter, and so Rachel would have no problem going into Caroline's apartment alone at night to get the money. Caroline planned to murder Rachel and stage it so it looked like Rachel had run away, and then afterwards, Caroline planned to lose 45 pounds and then get a nose job so she would look more like Rachel. And then to complete her transformation, Caroline would legally change her name to Rachel Barber. In November of 2000, Caroline Robertson pleaded guilty to murdering Rachel Barber and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In January of 2015, Caroline was released after only serving 15 of those 20 years. In the years after Rachel's death, Rachel's mother, Elizabeth, would write a book about the experience called The Perfect Victim, which would later be adapted into a major movie that starred some of Australia's biggest actors and actresses. On Wednesday, March 24th, 1999, Rachel Barber's body was once again lowered into the ground, except this time she was surrounded by friends and family and people who loved her. Over 850 people attended Rachel's funeral. They brought letters and poems and toys, which were all buried with Rachel, as were the blue shoes that Rachel so wanted that she planned to buy with the $100 Caroline had promised her. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen's, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast.